Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Anne, this is Painting Big, and welcome back to the Fundamentals of Miniature Painting episode, I think, 7? This is going to be dry brushing, everybody. Yeah, one of the first techniques that new miniature painters, at least here in North America, are typically taught or typically encounter for highlighting, right? So I'm going to go over that real quick. I'm going to talk about types of brushes that you'd want to use, your paint consistency, because you could do it a couple different ways, and give you just kind of an example of execution. All right, let's get to it. Yeah, oh, look at this, a dragon wing. Some of you may watch me on Twitch, on Reaper Miniatures Twitch, every weekday on the Pro Tips show, and we've been working on this kind of faux iridescent. It's not iridescent paint, it's actually just painted to kind of look that way. We've been working on this dragon wing. So you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Reaper Miniatures every weekday, late morning. It's 11:30 a.m. USA Central Time. We'll talk more about my socials at the end, but let's just jump into dry brushing, kind of where it comes from. It comes from oil painting. It's a technique that's used to bring out texture. So the best use for it is to bring out sculpted texture on your model. But you can also just use it as a highlighter, and a lot of people do, just because it can be quick and fairly simple once you get the hang of it. I did that on these wings. Even though they have a little bit of texture, they don't have a lot. So what happens is that dry brushing will bring out a texture that's kind of grainy. See that kind of, yeah. I did a little extra on this, but maybe you see the scratchy texture in here. See that scratchiness? That's dry brushing. And if you don't mind the texture, then it can be a really good, fast way to lay down some highlighting. But if you don't like the texture, then it's better to go for techniques that are more like layering, which we'll get into later on in this series of videos. However, if you don't like the texture, but you still really want to learn to use dry brushing, be aware that you can put a wash over the top of it, and that'll kind of hide the texture. So if you're willing to do multiple layers, you can get actually some pretty good effects, and that is kind of what I've done here. I've also gone back in and highlighted individual little places to kind of hide the fact that the dry brushing was used underneath. So let's talk about paint. Most people will tell you to use very thick paint for this. For example, the Games Workshop line, which has specific dry brush colors, that is very thick, like paste type of paint. And that is going to give you a much rougher, coarser texture when you dry brush on it. Here we're going to be using Master Series. Master Series is a little bit more fluid out the gate. And so it's not going to give us as much of that crumbly, like chunky, clunky texture. It may give us a little bit more of a streaky texture depending on how much we unload our brush. And let's talk about brushes. Obviously, I've been waving around this gigantic brush here. Just to give you an idea, more of a normal miniature size brush is like this, and I'm holding this giant Filbert. Filbert is the shape that you can see that's got the rounded top. It's like a flat brush, but with a rounded top instead of a straight top. You can also use a traditional flat like this. And you can also use, some companies sell rounds. So this is a Games Workshop Citadel small dry brush. As you can see, it's a bit thicker. It is a synthetic, which we'll talk about in just a second. It is kind of a rounded, right? It doesn't have a really great tip, and that's on purpose. They don't expect that to last very long when you're doing this with it. So you can find these brushes in smaller sizes as well. So if you want to try different brush shapes, it can be kind of fun to play with them. I actually really prefer a flat or a filbert. And when I do dry brush, it's usually for large projects. So I'm often using it on terrain. So these big brushes make sense, but you can find smaller sizes in those shapes. So let's talk about synthetic hair versus natural. You don't want to use your good sable brushes for these guys. All of these are synthetic, although this one on the end makes it kind of, hard to figure out that it's a synth. It looks a lot like a natural sable the way it's colored, but it is actually a synthetic. And the way to tell, other than looking at if it's a natural sable, it's going to say, and it doesn't say here, so it's a synthetic. The way to tell is just that a sable brush is going to be much softer. And it's not gonna have kind of the stiffness. You can definitely tell if you pet your brushes. You can totally tell that a sable tends to be a lot softer. And the fact that it is softer means it's not as good for this technique as a synthetic, where you want to be able to kind of flick the edge of the brush over the surface. You want a brush that's not going to fall apart or be soft and bendy. You want something that's going to stand up to it. So what do I mean when I say synthetic? Synthetic brushes come in a whole variety of colors and shapes. This is also a synthetic. Usually they're orange or white bristled, but they can also masquerade as normal brush colors. This Games Workshop one's never been used before. It's very reddish. But the thing they have in common is that they are all plastic. These are all just super micro, fine, tiny hairs made of plastic. So the upside is they tend to be cheaper, and for dry brushing they're good because they tend to be stiffer. The downside is that they're cheaper, so they're not quite made as well. The hairs don't hold as good of a point. That one is shedding as we speak. I can see a little hair poking out the top. And they also deform with use. So as you work, here's a smaller flat that I used for a lot of terrain. You can see that it has completely bushed out, and you see that curve, that hook that the hairs form. That's essentially abrasion of the synthetic hair. It just happens naturally. You really can't keep it from happening. There is a trick that I've heard of where you clean them with super hot water, which is said to kind of tame that kind of fuzziness and the curving, but you will lose it eventually. And some of them, the cheaper the synthetic, the faster you tend to kind of lose it. Now that said, using a brush like this for dry brushing like gravel, grass, terrain, things like that, totally doable, and it's why I still keep this brush around. So it's not like once you kind of wreck a brush, it's totally useless, right? So all that said, let's get into it. So just to recap, some of the great uses of dry brushing are for terrain, for basing materials. You can also use them for weathering, making kind of weather and mud and dirt textures on like vehicles and things. Vehicle modelers have used this technique for that for a very long time. And generally anywhere you want to bring out texture and kind of highlight it in a super fast way where you don't so much need it to be smooth. All right, so let's go for it. Now, use a big brush for big areas. When I'm doing buildings, large areas of basing terrain, or I'm doing dragon wings, I do use large brushes. And we're going to use our gigantic Filbert here today. And we're going to get a paper towel. So when you need something to unload your brush on, because you're going to load it up and then you're going to unload it, you really kind of want to have something textured. It kind of can help you see, like textured paper helps, or textured paper towel. Although since we're using white for this one, because I want you to see this, maybe the white paper towel is a little bit, not necessary. But in general, it can help if you can see how much texture your stuff is bringing up. So I've got some paint on the brush. Notice I'm not using a lot. The reason I'm not using a lot is that I kind of want to keep control. The other reason I'm not using a lot is that Master Series is a little more fluid, as I said, so it's going to spread through the brush pretty well. You can see how it's creeping up. So if I really want to do this here, I can test it on a small area. I can also just run it over my hand, so my skin is going to pick it up. See, I'm getting some streaky texture. But if I kind of go back and forth with that, I can hide it. So I'm going to maybe go over to a fresh spot on the paper towel, dry it off a little bit, and then we'll come back. All right, let's do it. So if you use a light stroke, you can get just a little bit of texture at a time. You can see the streakiness that I'm getting here, but I'm not too concerned because I'm planning to put a wash over this. So a little bit of texture is not too bad. Now you notice I'm moving, if you've watched other people dry brush, they go, they go super fast over and I can do that when my brush gets a little drier. But if your brush is a little wet off the bat, you may find that you are better off using a delicate touch and going a little slower. Now, if you notice that you've got scratchy texture in one direction, you can come back and go the opposite direction and hide it. And going back and forth with dry brushing like that is a pretty good technique. Now, as my brush gets drier, you can see that I'm putting a lot, less paint off of it now as I go up to the top here. Now, here's where I might switch to a smaller brush if I really wanted to. Now, the downside of dry brushing, and another reason you always want to use a cheap synthetic and not one of your good sables, is that it's going to make paint dry on your brush, right? It's already doing it. So do keep an eye on that. See how that's highlighted that nicely. Even though I used pure white, it still looks pretty decent. You can totally see the highlights. So When you notice that your paint is really starting to fail coming off, that's when it's time to rinse out your brush. Even so, you can see that I got some dried paint stuck in the brush. So after dry brushing, I'm going to want to take some brush cleaner and just get that off of there. I don't want that stuff to build up. This brush is still in pretty good shape, so I don't want to abuse it big time. So we've got some of that. If you use your paint even thinner than this, it will be even streakier, but you'll lose some of that powdery texture. Can you see the powdery texture I've got there? So if you don't like that and you're willing to go a little bit more wet, let's just do that real quick. Let's add a little water to my white paint and see what I can do with this. So thinning my paint, which is not something you're usually told to do with dry brushing. Let's see here. Let's start on the area that I've already been working on. Yeah, see, we've got, it's totally like coming off the brush and it's not wanting to kind of you make that fade effect, right? So that's why I always check it. I always test it in like odd areas. But it's actually, it's building it up a little bit better. Like it's definitely like leaving, you can see that it's leaving soft brush strokes, right? And if I don't want it to go down in the cracks here, I'll want to kind of angle my brush kind of flat and kind of rub it across the surfaces like here. Hold on. There you go. Kind of like this. So that'll retain the texture in the cracks. And up here, let's try to do this a little bit. I can also take a little bit more off my brush. See how much I can take off. That works a little bit better. And so I've gotten that ridge now. Since I have thinner paint, I can be more precise as long as I have a very delicate touch. So practice not being so heavy-handed sometimes with your dry brushing. See what kind of like, if you thin your paint and you have to clean off your brush a lot more, but you can get some softer effects with it. So now let's throw a wash over this and see how it looks. Normally, if I was doing the effect that I did down here on the rest of this wing, I would be putting a green wash over this to start out getting this kind of funky green to blue fade I've got. But I've got my blue mixed up, so we're just going to do that. And this is a handmade wash, just like I did in my How to Make Your Own Washes video. This is made with ultramarine shadow, which is also the base color of this wing. So if you like this blue, this is the color 9187 ultramarine shadow from Master Series Paint. One of my favorite blues. It's a beautiful, beautiful deep blue with just a hint of purple to it. It's a colder side blue, so it's not a warmer side blue. So we've got our wash here, and I'm just going to pretty much wipe it all down the wing. And I'll let it pool a little bit. But what should happen, and it may look really dark at first, but give it time, and you can see it already. Our highlights are coming through underneath. So I'm going to actually pull some of this excess wash off of here because I've got a lot of it on here. I don't really need it. So I'm going to rinse out my brush and dry it so that it'll slurp up paint. And I'm going to kind of just suck off some of this extra stuff. It'll make everything dry a little faster to do so. But you can see that the wash comes in. It brings back some of those lines that we maybe wiped out by getting a little heavy with our dry brushing. And it also helps disguise the texture, doesn't it? And when you're doing a wing, especially like a leathery dragon wing, having a little texture actually makes some sense. So if you have a little texture still showing through, that's not bad really on a wing at all, in my opinion. So, but we've minimized it. We've kind of disguised it. So now it looks more like a natural highlight. Another thing we could do is if we decided we like this highlight, but we'd actually like more, is we could wait for this to dry and then come back with another dry brush of white and just make it a little smaller, throw another wash over the top, and then we'd have kind of a gradient. Because we'd have our dark blue and then our first wash and then our second wash. And this one would go a little darker with another wash on it. And this would be our most recent spot of highlighting. So you can layer up dry brushing just like you can layer up any highlight. All right, there we go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video about dry brushing. Remember, I do stream on Twitch, as I mentioned earlier. My website is paintingbig.net, and you can find all my socials there, including my Twitch schedule and the link to my Patreon. Also, information about my Patreon and what kind of information is on the various levels of that. So if you're interested in the Patreon and you want to figure out, will Anne's Patreon fit me, go to my website, paintingbig.net, look at my Patreon page, and it'll give you kind of examples of topics that I've covered that are some of my favorites for the various levels. If you just want to go take a look at my Patreon, that's patreon.com/paintingbig. So I've got some free stuff up there. Take a look. I'm going to end this here. I've got a lot of interesting topics lined up for this. I'm going to try a new thing. I'm going to try to put out 2 videos a month. No guarantees, but I've been trying to get a little more time freed up so that I can devote it to this fundamental series because so many people are telling me they've enjoyed it. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week wherever you are. And this is Anne signing off.